Goals are what you hope might happen. Standards are what you insist must happen. Goals are wishes. Standards are demands you make of yourself. Goals live in your mind. Standards live in your very being. And there lies the difference between those who achieve extraordinary success and those who live lives of quiet desperation. Let me tell you about a man I once knew. Every January 1st, he would set the same goal, to lose 30 pounds. Every year, he would join a gym, buy the latest diet book, and declare this would be his year. And every year, by March, he was back to his old habits. This went on for 15 years. 15 years of the same goal, 15 years of the same failure. Then something changed. He stopped setting the goal to lose 30 pounds and instead raised his standard. He decided he was no longer the type of person who would accept being overweight. He changed his identity, not just his intention. Within 6 months, he had lost 40 pounds, and more importantly, he kept it off because his standard wouldn't allow him to be anything less than fit and healthy. That's the power of standards over goals. When you raise your standards, you change who you are at the core level. When you simply set goals, you're still the same person hoping for different results. Think about it this way. If I were to ask you what your goals are, you could probably rattle off a list. But if I were to ask you what your standards are, you might pause. You might struggle to answer because most people have never consciously decided what they will and will not accept in their lives. They've never drawn a line in the sand and said, this is who I am and this is what I demand of myself. Your standards are like the thermostat in your home. A thermostat doesn't hope the temperature will be right. It doesn't wish for the perfect climate. It maintains the standard you've set. When the temperature drops below your standard, the heat kicks in automatically. When it rises above your standard, the cooling begins. Your personal standards work the same way. They automatically regulate your behavior, your choices, your habits, and ultimately your results. But here's what most people don't understand. Your current life is a perfect reflection of your current standards. If you want to know what your real standards are, don't look at what you say you want. Look at what you have. Look at your bank account, your relationships, your health, your career. These are not accidents. These are the inevitable results of the standards you've been living by, often unconsciously. I remember when I was young and struggling financially, I would set goals to make more money, to get out of debt, to achieve financial success. But my standards were different from my goals. My standard was that it was okay to be broke as long as I was a nice person. My standard was that it was acceptable to have more month left at the end of my money. My standard was that financial struggle was normal and expected for someone from my background. With standards like those, no goal in the world could save me. It wasn't until I met my mentor, Oral Shoaf, that I learned the difference. He didn't help me set bigger goals. He helped me raise my standards. He helped me see that I had been accepting a life that was far below what I was capable of creating. He taught me that the problem wasn't my ability or my circumstances. The problem was that I had unconsciously set my standards too low. Earl used to say, Jim, if you want to be wealthy, you don't need to learn how to make money. You need to become the kind of person who won't accept being poor. That one statement changed everything for me. It shifted my focus from trying to achieve something outside of myself to transforming who I was inside myself. This is why New Year's resolutions fail so spectacularly. People set goals without changing their standards. They say they want to exercise every day, but their standard is that it's okay to skip when they don't feel like it. They say they want to save money, but their standard is that it's acceptable to spend impulsively when something catches their eye. They say they want to improve their relationships, but their standard is that it's normal to take the people they love for granted. Your standards are not just about what you do. They're about who you are. They're about what you will and will not tolerate from yourself and from others. They're about the minimum level of quality you demand in every area of your life. Consider the most successful people you know or have studied. What sets them apart isn't that they have bigger goals than everyone else. What sets them apart is that they have higher standards. They demand more of themselves. They won't accept mediocrity. They won't settle for less than their best effort. They won't tolerate excuses, even from themselves. I've had the privilege of meeting and working with some extraordinary individuals over the years. Millionaires, world-class athletes, renowned artists, influential leaders. And in every case, What impressed me most wasn't their talent or their luck or even their goals. It was their standards. They had decided at some point in their lives that they would not accept anything less than excellence from themselves. One businessman I knew had a standard that every phone call would be returned within 4 hours. Not 4.5 hours. Not the next day when it was convenient. 4 hours, period. This wasn't a goal he hoped to achieve. This was a standard he lived by. Do you think that standard affected only his phone calls? Of course not. That standard of responsiveness and reliability permeated every aspect of his business and his life. It became part of who he was, and it contributed significantly to his extraordinary success. Another woman I met had a standard that she would never speak negatively about another person. Not because she was trying to be nice, but because she had decided that kind of conversation was beneath her standards. She wouldn't participate in gossip, criticism, or complaining because it didn't align with who she had chosen to be. Do you think that standard affected only her conversations? Absolutely not. It affected her relationships, her reputation, her opportunities, and her overall quality of life. These people didn't stumble into success by accident. They didn't achieve their results through wishful thinking or positive affirmations alone. They achieved their results because they had consciously raised their standards and refused to live below them. Now, I want to be clear about something. Raising your standards isn't about becoming perfect overnight. It's not about setting impossible expectations that lead to frustration and failure. Raising your standards is about deciding who you want to become and then aligning your daily choices with that decision. When you truly raise your standards, something magical happens. You stop making excuses. You stop accepting your own limitations as permanent. You stop settling for less than you're capable of achieving. You become resourceful instead of resentful. You become proactive instead of reactive. You become the author of your life instead of a victim of your circumstances. But here's the challenge. Raising your standards requires you to confront some uncomfortable truths about yourself and your life. It requires you to admit that much of what you've been accepting isn't actually acceptable. It requires you to take responsibility for your results instead of blaming your genetics, your upbringing, your boss, the economy, or any other external factor. This is why most people prefer to set goals rather than raise standards. Goals allow you to stay comfortable with who you are while hoping for different results. Standards force you to evolve into the person capable of creating those results. Goals are about having. Standards are about being. Let me share with you a personal example. Years ago, I had a goal to become a better speaker. I would practice occasionally, read books about public speaking, and hope that somehow I would improve. My results were mediocre at best. Then I shifted from having a goal to raising my standard. I decided that I was the kind of person who delivered exceptional value every time I spoke. I was the kind of person who prepared meticulously for every presentation. I was the kind of person who constantly sought to improve my skills and serve my audience at the highest level. Once I raised that standard, everything changed. I didn't practice occasionally anymore. I practiced daily because that's what someone with my standard would do. I didn't hope to improve. I demanded improvement from myself because anything less was unacceptable. The goal was the same, but the standard transformed both my approach and my results. This principle applies to every area of life. If you want to improve your health, don't just set a goal to exercise more or eat better. Raise your standard and become the kind of person who treats their body as a temple. Become someone who won't tolerate feeling sluggish, overweight, or unhealthy. When that becomes your standard, the behaviors fall automatically. If you want to improve your finances, don't just set a goal to save more money or increase your income. Raise your standard and become the kind of person who manages money wisely. Become someone who won't tolerate financial carelessness or living paycheck to paycheck. When that becomes your standard, you'll find ways to improve your financial situation that you never noticed before. If you want better relationships, don't just set a goal to be more loving or communicative. Raise your standard and become the kind of person who brings out the best in others. Become someone who won't tolerate taking the people they love for granted. When that becomes your standard, your relationships will transform naturally. The beauty of standards is that they work even when you're not consciously thinking about them. They become part of your automatic behavior. They become part of your identity. They become part of who you are at the deepest level. But I must warn you about something. When you raise your standards, your life will become temporarily uncomfortable. Why? Because there will be a gap between who you've decided to become and who you've been up until now. There will be a period of adjustment where you're learning new habits, developing new skills, and breaking old patterns. Most people, when they encounter this discomfort, lower their standards back to their comfort zone. They decide it's easier to accept mediocrity than to endure the temporary pain of growth. This is why so few people live extraordinary lives. They're unwilling to maintain higher standards long enough for them to become natural. But if you can persist through this uncomfortable period, if you can maintain your new standards even when it's difficult, something wonderful happens. The new behaviors become habits. The new habits become natural. The new natural behaviors become part of your identity. And when that happens, achieving extraordinary results becomes as automatic as breathing. I've watched this process happen hundreds of times with people I've mentored over the years. At first, they struggle to live up to their new standards. They make mistakes. They occasionally slip back into old patterns. But if they persist, if they refuse to lower their standards, something shifts. They begin to embody the standards they've set. The standards become who they are, not just what they do. One young man I worked with decided to raise his standard on punctuality. He had always been chronically late, and it was affecting his career and his relationships. Instead of setting a goal to be on time more often, he decided he was the kind of person who respected others by being early to every appointment. This wasn't comfortable at first. He had to change his entire morning routine. He had to plan ahead more carefully. He had to leave earlier than felt natural. But he maintained his standard. Within a few months, being early had become second nature. More importantly, this single standard change affected every other area of his life. He became more organized, more reliable, more respected by his colleagues. His career accelerated, his relationships improved, and his self-respect soared. One standard, maintained consistently, transformed his entire life. This is the power of standards over goals. Goals focus on a specific outcome. Standards transform your entire way of being. Goals are about achieving something once. Standards are about becoming someone permanently. Now, you might be wondering, how do I actually raise my standards? It's a fair question, and the answer is both simple and profound. You raise your standards by making a decision about who you choose to be. And then you honor that decision through your daily actions, regardless of how you feel in the moment. The first step is to identify what standards you've been living by unconsciously. Look at your current results in every area of your life. Your results are a mirror reflection of your standards. If you're not happy with your results, you need to raise your standards. Ask yourself these questions. What have I been accepting in my life that I shouldn't accept? What behaviors have I been tolerating from myself that are keeping me from the life I want? What minimum level of quality have I been settling for that needs to be raised? Be honest with yourself. Don't sugarcoat it. Don't make excuses. Just look at the facts. Your bank account reflects your financial standards. Your relationships reflect your relationship standards. Your health reflects your health standards. Your career reflects your professional standards. Your daily habits reflect your personal standards. Once you've identified your current standards, the next step is to consciously decide what your new standards will be. This isn't about becoming perfect overnight. It's about defining the minimum level of quality you will accept from yourself going forward. For example, instead of having a goal to exercise more, you might decide that your standard is to move your body for at least 30 minutes every day, no exceptions. This isn't negotiable. This isn't something you'll do when you feel motivated. This is who you are now. Instead of having a goal to read more books, you might decide that your standard is to spend at least 20 minutes every day learning something new. Again, this isn't optional. This is part of your identity now. Instead of having a goal to be more positive, you might decide that your standard is never to complain without also offering a solution. This becomes part of how you show up in the world. The key is to choose standards that stretch you but don't break you. If you try to change everything at once, you'll likely become overwhelmed and give up. Better to choose one or two key areas where raising your standards will have the greatest impact on your life. Once you've decided on your new standards, the real work begins. You must live by these standards every single day, especially when you don't feel like it. This is where most people fail. They set high standards when they're motivated and inspired, but they abandon them when life gets challenging or when their emotions change. Standards are not dependent on your mood. Standards are not dependent on your circumstances. Standards are not dependent on how you feel on any given day. Standards are who you are, period. I learned this lesson the hard way early in my career. I had decided that my standard was to always deliver more value than I was paid for. This was easy to maintain when I was working with clients I liked, on projects I enjoyed, in situations that were favorable. But what about when I was dealing with difficult people? What about when I was having a bad day? What about when I felt underappreciated or underpaid? I discovered that maintaining your standards during the difficult times is what separates truly successful people from everyone else. Anyone can maintain high standards when everything is going well. The test of your character and ultimately your success is whether you maintain your standard when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, or unrewarded. This brings me to another crucial point about standards. They must be unconditional. They cannot be dependent on other people's behavior. They cannot be dependent on external circumstances. They must be about who you are, regardless of what's happening around you. For instance, if your standard is to always treat people with respect and kindness, that standard must hold even when others are rude to you. If your standard is to always do your best work, that standard must hold even when you feel your efforts aren't appreciated. If your standard is to maintain your integrity, that standard must hold even when compromising would be easier or more profitable. This is difficult, but it's also what makes standards so powerful. When you maintain high standards unconditionally, you develop an unshakable core of self-respect and personal power. You become someone you can count on. You become someone others can count on. You become magnetic to opportunities and success because people are drawn to those who live by principles rather than by convenience. I want to tell you about a woman I met who embodied this principle beautifully. She was a customer service representative for a large company, and she had decided that her standard was to make every customer interaction positive, regardless of how the customer treated her. This wasn't a company policy. This wasn't something she was required to do. This was simply who she had chosen to be. Day after day, she would encounter frustrated customers, angry customers, unreasonable customers. But she never lowered her standards. She remained professional, helpful, and kind in every interaction. Did this always work? No, some customers remained difficult no matter how she treated them. But something interesting happened over time. Word spread about this exceptional employee. Customers began requesting to speak with her specifically. Management noticed her outstanding performance. Within 2 years, she had been promoted 3 times. Within 5 years, she was running the customer service department. Within 10 years, she was a vice president of the company. Did she achieve this success because she had bigger goals than her colleagues? I don't think so. She achieved this success because she had higher standards than her colleagues. She refused to let external circumstances determine her internal behavior. She maintained her standard regardless of how others acted, and that standard became the foundation of her extraordinary career. This illustrates another important aspect of standards. They compound over time. When you maintain high standards consistently, they create a reputation. They create trust. They create opportunities. They create momentum. Small actions performed to high standards over long periods create massive results. Most people underestimate the power of consistency. They want big results quickly, so they focus on big goals and dramatic actions. But extraordinary lives are built through ordinary actions performed to extraordinary standards day after day, year after year. Think about the most successful businesses you know. What sets them apart isn't that they do something completely different from their competitors. What sets them apart is that they do ordinary things to higher standards. They maintain quality when their competitors cut corners. They serve customers well when their competitors provide mediocre service. They innovate when their competitors become complacent. The same principle applies to individuals. The most successful people aren't necessarily the most talented or the most privileged. They're the people who maintain higher standards over longer periods than their peers. I learned this lesson from studying successful people throughout history. Whether they were entrepreneurs, artists, athletes, or leaders, they all shared one common characteristic They had high personal standards, and they maintained them consistently, especially when it was difficult to do so. One of my favorite examples is the story of a young athlete who wasn't the most naturally gifted on his team. He wasn't the fastest, he wasn't the strongest, and he wasn't the most coordinated. But he had a standard that he would never be outworked. Every day he would be the first one to practice and the last one to leave. Every drill, every exercise, every opportunity to improve was approached with maximum effort. His teammates thought he was obsessed. His coaches thought he was trying too hard. But he maintained his standard regardless of what others thought or said. Over time, his relentless commitment to excellence began to pay off. His skills improved. His conditioning improved. His confidence improved. By the end of his college career, he was the team captain and the most valuable player. He went on to have a successful professional career not because he was the most talented, but because he had the highest standards and he refused to compromise them. This story illustrates something crucial about standards. They don't just improve your results. They improve you as a person. They develop your character. They build your self-respect. They create a foundation of confidence that no external circumstance can shake. When you know you've maintained your standards regardless of the outcome, you can hold your head high regardless of the results. You develop what I call standards-based confidence rather than results-based confidence. Results-based confidence goes up and down with your circumstances. Standards-based confidence remains steady because it's based on who you are, not what happens to you. This brings me to a critical distinction. Many people confuse standards with perfectionism, but they're entirely different concepts. Perfectionism is about never making mistakes. Standards are about never making excuses. Perfectionism is about achieving flawless results. Standards are about maintaining consistent effort and behavior. Perfectionists are often paralyzed by the fear of failure. People with high standards embrace failure as part of the learning process, but they refuse to fail to try. Perfectionists lower their standards when they encounter setbacks. People with true standards maintain their standards, especially when they encounter setbacks. I've seen many talented people limit their success because they confuse standards with perfectionism. They would start projects with high intentions, but if they couldn't do them perfectly, they would quit entirely rather than do them to the best of their current ability. They would rather do nothing than do something imperfectly. This is a tragic mistake. High standards don't require perfection. High standards require doing your best with what you have where you are right now. They require continuous improvement, not immediate perfection. They require commitment to growth, not immunity to failure. When you understand this distinction, you become unstoppable. You can maintain high standards while accepting that you'll make mistakes along the way. You can demand excellence from yourself while acknowledging that excellence is a direction, not a destination. This perspective allows you to take more risks, try more things, and ultimately achieve more than perfectionists who are paralyzed by the fear of falling short of impossible standards. It also makes the journey more enjoyable because you're focused on becoming rather than on achieving, on the process rather than on the outcome. Now, let me address something that concerns many people when they first consider raising their standards. They worry that high standards will make them rigid, uptight, or difficult to be around. They fear that standards will eliminate spontaneity and joy from their lives. This concern is understandable but misguided. High standards don't eliminate joy from your life. They eliminate the sources of stress, regret, and disappointment that come from living below your potential. High standards don't make you rigid. They make you reliable. They don't make you uptight. They make you someone others can count on. In fact, I've found that people with high standards tend to be happier and more fulfilled than people with low standards. Why? Because they respect themselves, because they're proud of how they show up in the world, because they don't have to deal with the regret and disappointment that comes from settling for less than their best. When you maintain high standards, you sleep better at night because you know you've given your best effort. You have more energy during the day because you're not carrying the weight of unfinished business or compromised values. You have better relationships because people trust and respect you. You have more opportunities because your reputation precedes you. High standards also create what I call positive momentum. When you do something well, it makes it easier to do the next thing well. When you maintain your standards in one area, it becomes natural to maintain them in other areas. Success builds on success. Excellence becomes a habit. I've watched this positive momentum transform countless lives. People start by raising their standards in one small area, perhaps punctuality or physical fitness. But maintaining that standard creates confidence and discipline that spills over into other areas. Before long, their entire life is operating at a higher level. Conversely, I've also seen how low standards create negative momentum. When you accept mediocrity in one area, it becomes easier to accept it in other areas. When you make excuses in one situation, it becomes natural to make excuses in other situations. Mediocrity also becomes a habit. This is why it's so important to choose your standards carefully and maintain them consistently. The standards you live by today are creating the momentum that will determine your future. Speaking of the future, let me share with you one of the most profound realizations I've had about standards and time. Most people think about standards in terms of their present circumstances. They ask, what standards can I maintain given my current situation? But this is backward thinking. The question you should ask is, what standards do I need to maintain today to create the future I want? Your standards today are literally creating your life 5, 10, 20 years from now. The person you're becoming through your daily standards is the person who will be living your future life. If you want to be wealthy in the future, you need to maintain the standards of wealthy thinking and behavior today, even if you don't have wealth yet. If you want to be healthy in the future, you need to maintain the standards of healthy living today, even if you're not in perfect shape yet. If you want to have great relationships in the future, you need to maintain the standards of great relationship behavior today, even if your current relationships aren't perfect yet. This requires faith and vision. It requires believing in who you're becoming even when the external evidence doesn't support it yet. It requires maintaining standards that seem unrealistic given your current circumstances, but are perfectly realistic given your future potential. I learned this lesson when I was still struggling financially, but had decided to live by the standards of a successful person. People thought I was being pretentious or unrealistic. They couldn't understand why I would invest in my education when I was broke, why I would dress professionally when I didn't have a professional job, why I would associate with successful people when I wasn't successful yet. But I understood something they didn't. I was becoming the person who would create the life I wanted. I was building the foundation of future success through present standards. I was investing in my future self by maintaining standards that stretched my current circumstances. It wasn't easy, it wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. And over time, my external circumstances began to align with my internal standards. The gap between who I was becoming and what I had began to close. The future I had been preparing for through my standards became my present reality. This is the true power of understanding that your standards decide your future, not your goals. Goals are about what you want to have. Standards are about who you need to become to have it. And becoming always precedes having. Let me share another story that illustrates this principle beautifully. I once knew a young woman who dreamed of owning her own business but was currently working in a low-level administrative position. Instead of just dreaming about business ownership, she decided to live by the standards of a business owner right where she was. She started treating her current job as if it were her own business. She looked for ways to improve efficiency, reduce costs, and increase value. She took initiative on projects without being asked. She studied business principles in her spare time. She dressed and acted like an executive, even though she wasn't one yet. Her colleagues thought she was overreaching. Her friends told her she was wasting her time. But she maintained her standards regardless of the criticism or lack of immediate rewards. She was becoming an entrepreneur before she became an entrepreneur. Within 2 years, her efforts had been noticed by upper management, and she was promoted to a supervisory role. Within 4 years, she was managing a department. Within 6 years, she had saved enough money and developed enough skills and connections to start her own consulting business. Within 10 years, she had built $1 million company. Did this happen because she had bigger goals than other people? I don't think so. It happened because she lived by higher standards than other people. She became the person capable of building a successful business before she actually had a successful business. This story illustrates something crucial about the relationship between standards and opportunity. When you maintain high standards consistently, you become magnetic to opportunities. People notice excellence. People are drawn to reliability. People want to associate with and invest in individuals who maintain high standards regardless of their circumstances. Opportunities don't usually come to people who are hoping and wishing and dreaming. Opportunities come to people who are already demonstrating through their standards that they're ready for greater responsibilities and rewards. This is why focusing on standards rather than goals is so much more effective. Goals make you an opportunity seeker. Standards make you an opportunity magnet. Goals require you to chase success. Standards cause success to chase you. But I want to be very clear about something. Raising your standards is not about impressing other people or meeting other people's expectations. It's about becoming the person you're capable of becoming. It's about living up to your own potential. It's about respecting yourself enough to demand your own best effort. In fact, one of the most liberating aspects of living by high personal standards is that you become less dependent on external validation. When you know you're maintaining your standards, you don't need others to tell you you're doing well. When you're living up to your own expectations, you become less concerned with meeting others' expectations. This doesn't mean you become arrogant or indifferent to feedback. It means you develop an internal compass that guides your behavior regardless of external circumstances. You become self-directed rather than other-directed. You become proactive rather than reactive. I've found that people who live by high standards tend to be more generous, more helpful, and more supportive of others, not less so. Why? Because they're not competing with others for limited resources or recognition. They're competing with themselves to become better than they were yesterday. When you're focused on maintaining your own standards, you're not threatened by others' success. You're inspired by it. When you're secure in your own commitment to excellence, you want others to succeed as well. You become a lifter of others rather than a critic of others. This creates a positive cycle in your relationships and your community. As you maintain high standards, you inspire others to raise their standards. As others raise their standards, they create an environment that supports and encourages your continued growth. Success becomes contagious in the best possible way. Now, I want to address a concern that many people have when they consider raising their standards. They worry about what will happen if they can't maintain their new standards. They fear that failing to live up to high standards will make them feel worse about themselves than having low standards in the first place. This concern reveals a fundamental misunderstanding about standards. The purpose of standards is not to make you feel good about yourself when you meet them. The purpose of standards is to call forth the best in you regardless of how you feel about your current performance. When you fail to live up to your standards, and you will sometimes fail, the question is not whether you should lower your standards to match your performance. The question is whether you will recommit to raising your performance to match your standards. Standards are not about being perfect. Standards are about being committed. They're not about never falling down. They're about always getting back up. They're not about avoiding all mistakes. They're about learning from mistakes and refusing to repeat them. Every time you recommit to your standards after falling short, you build character. You build resilience. You build the kind of inner strength that enables you to handle bigger challenges and pursue bigger dreams. The temporary discomfort of falling short of your standards is far preferable to the permanent disappointment of living below your potential. I learned this lesson through many personal failures and recommitments throughout my life. There were times when I failed to live up to my own standards, times when I let myself down, times when I acted in ways that were inconsistent with who I had chosen to be. In those moments, I had a choice. I could lower my standards to match my behavior, or I could raise my behavior to match my standards. Every time I chose to maintain my standards and improve my behavior rather than lower my standards and accept my failures, I grew stronger. I became more reliable to myself. I developed the kind of self-trust that enables you to set bigger goals and take bigger risks because you know you can count on yourself to do what you say you'll do. This brings me to one of the most important points I want to make about standards. They must be your standards, not someone else's standards imposed on you. Standards that are imposed by others, whether parents, spouses, bosses, society, will always feel like burden rather than empowerment. True standards come from within. They come from your own vision of who you want to become. They come from your own values and your own commitment to growth. They must be chosen, not imposed. They must be embraced, not endured. This is why it's so important to take time to consciously decide what your standards will be. Don't just drift through life accepting whatever standards your environment suggests. Don't just follow the crowd or try to meet others' expectations. Decide for yourself what kind of person you want to be and what kind of life you want to live, and then set standards that will move you in that direction. When your standards are truly your own, maintaining them becomes a source of strength and satisfaction rather than stress and struggle. They become expressions of who you are rather than burdens you carry.